It looks like Apple may be this close to being banned from importing phones that use Intel chipsets rather than Qualcomm chipsets as a modem. For those of you who are not really sure who Qualcomm is a company that creates processors as well as creating all different types of baseband chipsets for mobile phones that allow the phone to communicate with cell phone towers and place phone calls and grab data and transmit video and all the things that you do with a modern smartphone. Now, they also have a lot of patents filed on all the different technology that's utilized for a cell phone to be able to communicate with the cell phone tower at 3G or 4G or LTE speeds. As a result, most mobile phone providers are paying Qualcomm, if not for chipsets, at least for licensing fees for their patents. Apple made a departure from their previous design with the iPhone 7. Whereas with older phones, they would only use one manufacturer for the modem. Now, with the iPhone 7 and up, Apple has decided to use both Intel and Qualcomm for their phones. Some iPhone 7s contain an Intel chipset for the modem. Some iPhone 7s contain a Qualcomm chipset for the modem. Even if Apple says we're only going to use Intel going forward, they would still have to pay patents and royalty fees to Qualcomm for the fact that they're using Qualcomm's intellectual property inside of their phones. Now, since Qualcomm was involved with a lot of the creation of the specification and the standard for new wireless technologies, since they're always kind of getting their patented devices worked into the standard, it's expected that they use reasonable and non-discriminatory license terms. If I'm involved in creating the standard for repair, and I say everybody who repairs Apple laptops needs to use the Rossmann screwdriver, you would kind of expect that I sell that screwdriver at a reasonable or non-discriminatory way, since I have been given the privilege of creating that new standard. The big question that's coming about here when you write these type of subjective terms into the law, who defines reasonable? This is something I've talked about with the right to repair bill, where it says that manufacturers should supply parts or diagnostic tools or schematics at a reasonable price. Who defines reasonable? Who is going to determine what reasonable is? Well, the answer here seems to be with multi-billion-dollar court battles that are fought out through long periods of time. Apple did manage to get the licensing cost reduced to something like $10 a phone as a result of agreeing with Qualcomm to A, not challenge their patents, and B, not instigate regulatory bodies to look into their behavior or how they do licensing. And that was working for a short period of time. Those type of agreements would make it very difficult, if not impossible, for other companies like Intel to compete with Qualcomm for Apple's modem and chipset business. However, while this agreement worked for a short period of time, we can see that that's slowly starting to come to an end. Apple has recently decided that they are not going to pay these licensing fees to Qualcomm anymore because they're too high. Apple, the company that decides after you spend $2,300 on a laptop and an additional $1,000 on a phone that you need to spend $79.99 on a dongle to connect it to, is saying that somebody else is charging too much money. The company that is the most profitable smartphone manufacturer on planet Earth, that has some of the highest profit margins per phone sold, that was one of the first companies to mass manufacture a smartphone that sold for $1,000 that so many people bought, has the gall to say that somebody else is charging too much money for the intellectual property that allows the device to be a smartphone. Around the same time that Apple decided we're going to stop paying these fees, the FTC had sought a court order against Qualcomm to stop them from charging unjust royalties. At the same time that this mess is going on, the United States International Trade Association suggested that a trade judge find Apple guilty of infringing on Qualcomm's patents, which could lead to Apple being blocked from importing phones that use Intel's chipsets until they stop infringing on Qualcomm's patents. Now, one of Apple's reasons that they think that they should not have to pay is because the fee is simply too high. They think that it's just too much money. So their way of reacting is, rather than continuing to negotiate, saying, we're going to continue using your intellectual property and chipsets, just not going to pay for it. But hey, we're Apple. We can do what we want. And they do have an interesting point here. Their assertion is that we should be paying based on the chip, not on the retail gross cost of the device. So right now, Apple is paying a fee to Qualcomm based on a percentage of the cost of the retail device to the customer. So even though Apple may be using the exact same modem in a 32 gigabyte phone as they do in a 128 gigabyte phone, as it currently stands, Apple has to pay Qualcomm more money for the phone that is 128 gigabytes, even though they use the same modem, which they consider to be ridiculous. And it's easy to understand why. That modem chipset is the same exact modem chipset using the exact same intellectual property, regardless of whether it's 32 gigabytes or 128 gigabytes. Why should Apple's choice to charge more money based on storage configuration affect what they pay to be able to put a modem into their phone? And fair enough. Qualcomm is saying that their technology, which they're licensing out at very low rates, allows companies like Apple to make hundreds of billions of dollars. And also, fair enough. Apple's point is that they should not have to pay a higher rate for that same modem technology just because it's used in a phone that has more storage. And I understand that argument. However, at the same time, the only reason that this is even the case is because Apple's business model is such that they force their users to pay Apple an increased above market rate to upgrade their storage, and Apple, by not having an SD card slot in the phone, locks the user into that model. With an Android phone, I can easily increase my storage capacity by 200 gigabytes by simply purchasing a $55 Class 10 high-quality SD card on Amazon. With an iPhone, if I want an additional 200 gigabytes of storage, I have to pay Apple over $150. That's almost $100 more than I would have to pay to upgrade the storage on an Android phone. And the only reason that I am forced to pay Apple that additional money is because they lock me into their model by not putting removable storage in the phone like every other company. Which is why when I read this, I think to myself, yeah, that may kind of be unfair that Qualcomm is charging you a rate based on the percentage retail cost of the device rather than based on the technology you want to license, but at the same time, tough shit because you also do that to your own users. So I'm kind of curious what you would think there. You see where this is kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. Apple is saying, we do not want to pay royalties because they're too much, while at the same time, their example of why the royalty would be increased is based on their own overcharging for internal phone storage that you cannot pop an SD card into like almost any other phone on the market. Now, I do understand Apple's point, which is why should we have to pay more for a modem just because it's going into a phone that has more storage? But at the same time, a lot of consumers are thinking to themselves, why should I have to pay Apple a ridiculously above market rate for storage so that you can decide what storage goes into my phone? The very point that consumers are bothered by Apple with is the point that Apple is bothered by Qualcomm with. So this lack of self-awareness and self-knowledge is just something that I find hilarious while I'm looking through this case, and it's something I felt like pointing out before continuing. The way I see it, you live by the douchey business model, you die by the douchey business model. I understand entirely why it is a company like Qualcomm is going to want to protect their intellectual property business even more so than their chipset business. If we look at figures, it looks like just a few years ago, they made $7.66 billion from licensing and only $1.8 billion in net profit from chipset sales. So licensing is a much bigger business for Qualcomm than is chipset sales, and if they're putting that much research and development into creating the intellectual property that other companies are going to be using, I understand why they would ask for something as crazy as a percentage of the gross retail cost of the device rather than creating some sort of flat rate licensing fee based on the technology or the chipset that a company like Apple may want to utilize. So this is where this becomes a bit of a swampy mess. Apple's agreement with Qualcomm was that we're not going to challenge your patents and we're not going to get regulators or government involved in negotiating the licensing fees or the patent royalty fees or any of that stuff. But Apple executive Tim Cook winds up speaking to Samsung executive Jay Lee. He says to Jay Lee, get aggressive with Qualcomm. We need to get aggressive. Right after he says that, Qualcomm gets fined $850 million in South Korea. Right after Qualcomm gets fined in South Korea for unfair and unjust patent licensing, it's found out that Jay Lee, the one that Tim Cook spoke to, was indicted for bribing the South Korea government, in particular South Korean President Park. So the person that Tim Cook spoke to was bribing the president of South Korea. Then South Korea's government winds up doing something that would benefit Samsung in negotiations, that would also benefit Apple? That's a little bit suspicious. That's a little bit swampy. It is entirely possible that Apple provoked Samsung to go after Qualcomm, and it is entirely possible that Jay Lee was bribing the president of South Korea, had the ear of the government, and managed to get the government to levy this $850 million fine on Qualcomm to help Samsung's ability to negotiate. It is possible that Apple had Samsung do Apple's dirty work for them to help them be in a better negotiating position when it comes to talking about these licensing, patent, and royalty fees. Soon after after the Korea case, the FTC in the United States started going after Qualcomm, accusing them of maintaining a monopoly to charge higher royalty fees. This is a really large and disgusting mess. Now remember, at the same time that the FTC is going after Qualcomm, claiming that they've charged unjust royalties, the ITC is going after Apple for infringing on Qualcomm's patents. Now, courts don't have to listen to what the ITC says, but typically courts rule alongside ITC guidelines and suggestions. And the ITC does agree that Apple appears to have infringed on some of Qualcomm's patents. If that goes forward, then Qualcomm does have a legitimate gripe where they can say, government, stop Apple from importing devices that infringe on our patents. A judge could rule in favor of Qualcomm there, which would not allow them to import iPhones. However, Qualcomm is saying, listen, we're not going to say you can't import any of your devices. We're just saying that you can't import the ones that have Intel chipsets. So even though Qualcomm could apply this potential ruling to all Apple devices using Qualcomm intellectual property, they're specifically singling out Apple devices that use Intel chipsets instead of Qualcomm chipsets. Apple is asserting that by making this complaint that Qualcomm is using the power of the state, that Qualcomm is using the government, the ITC, to enforce their monopoly. Really, Apple? Really? That's your assertion? That another company is using the power of the government to enforce a monopoly? Of all the companies to make that complaint, you, Apple, using Immigrations and Customs Enforcement to stop Jessa Jones, a mom in a town of like 40 people, from importing iPhone screens so that she can fix them for local customers when you say you don't want to because their phones are bent. Really? You're the one making this complaint. The same company that when a guy in Norway sends screens to China to be refurbished and then can't re-import them because you sue him because they still have an Apple logo on them, even though he was refurbishing them rather than selling them as new. You're the company complaining that another company is trying to use the government to enforce a monopoly. Really? What kind of lack of self-awareness do you need to actually make that argument with a straight face and not have everybody just laugh at you? Now, is there a point there? Absolutely, there's a point there. If Qualcomm manages to do this, other companies in the United States will be less interested in investing in this technology. They will be less interested in trying to compete with Qualcomm. They'll be less interested in investing in the mobile space. And as a result, other countries may leap ahead of us when it comes to mobile technology. That is an argument that is being posited, and that is actually a very good argument that giving one company the monopoly rights like this is going to lead to less innovation in the long run. That's an argument that somebody may be able to run with, and that using the state to enforce a monopoly is also something that's not a great thing to do. But as I mentioned in a video that I'm going to link to right up here, and I suggest everybody watch it, if you're going to be the bitch, be the whole bitch. You don't get to decide that this rule applies to everybody else, but then doesn't apply to me. The most common criticism that I get is, Lewis, listen, I get that you don't want to be Apple authorized. You want to do things your way because their way doesn't make sense to you. But if Apple says that you have to be authorized and that it's their intellectual property, then you shouldn't be allowed to import the parts. Even if I'm importing parts from vendors that are more than happy to sell them to me, from vendors that are entering free market voluntary transactions with me, where I pay them and they're happy, and they send me parts and I'm happy, Apple has a right to interfere in that free market voluntary transaction because they're intellectual property, and because I'm not authorized. The criticism is clear, and the criticism is simple. If I don't want to play by this company's rules, I shouldn't try to renegotiate, I shouldn't protest, I should just not play at all. But do they care? I'm sorry. Do they appear to care? Okay. So Qualcomm is saying in a free market transaction, if you want to use our intellectual property, here's the fee. Here's what we're going to charge you. And what we're charging you is actually fair. We're not charging you a rate that's insane. We're not charging you a rate that doesn't allow you to make money. You're the most profitable smartphone manufacturer in the world. You have over $400 billion in the bank. You're worth over $900 billion in the stock market. It's not like Apple's not able to make money as a result of these licensing fees. At the same time, that company that's worth over $900 billion in the stock market is the company that's saying, yeah, we're just not going to pay because we think that we shouldn't have to pay all that much. F you. I'm sorry. And this is the company that I'm supposed to respect when they say that Immigrations and Customs Enforcement should take the stuff that I import because my free market voluntary transaction with a vendor in China is not valid? No, fuck off. And if the company that's worth $900 billion is the company that's saying, that's too much money, we're not going to pay, even though that deal is a deal that allows us to become valued at $900 billion, then no, sorry, no. You don't get to say that the rules apply to you a different way than they apply to me. You don't get to play that whole, oh, this company shouldn't be allowed to use the power of the government to help enforce a monopoly because that's bad for innovation and consumers, while at the same time doing that exact same thing every single turn with your own business. No, if you're going to be the bitch, be the whole bitch. Do I think that Apple has a lot of points here? Yes. Do I think Qualcomm has a lot of points here? Yes. I'm not an expert on intellectual property, nor am I an expert on patent law, but what I do think, 110%, what I will stand by, is that if Apple is going to make these arguments in defense of themselves, then they had better stop using the opposite of those arguments to prosecute us. That's it for today, and as always, I hope you learned something.